And continuing our Newsmaker now with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, thank you for joining us.
Hi, happy to be here.
Dr. Ostrower, I wanted to start out with the Steve Linick situation. The Inspector General for the State Department has been fired. Now, two ways to look at this kind of thing. One, the view critical of Trump is that, hey, so much turnover, how can we function properly? The other way to look at it, I think that Trump defenders would say, hey, he's draining the swamp, which is what he promised. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about this Inspector General for the State Department. The Trump administration has had huge turnover. You can see articles that are sympathetic to Trump on this. You can see articles that are very critical of the president on this. What do you make of this current firing? And what do you think of it in terms of policy? Well, maybe not policy, but the whole administrative side, Gary.
Brian, before I mention that, and I'd be happy to talk about this fellow,
Sure.
Steve Linick, who is the Inspector General, I did want to mention something more or less local in this area. You know,
Sure.
We are supportive, as much as we can possibly be supportive, of our local business. That, you know, this area is not exactly thriving in respect to the prosperity generally that New York State has enjoyed for the last decade or so. But there's a golf course that was going to close, that we expected to close, the Vanderview Golf Course, which is right in Alfred, in the town of Alfred. And it was recently announced that the Vanderview Golf Course is not going to close. It is indeed open. It's under new management. The course is in excellent condition. And for those of you who are golfers who want to pay $125 for an entire season's pass, consider Vanderview Course. I think it's a real resource. So far as Steve Linick and the issue of the Inspector General is concerned, I think there are a number of different ways to look at this. The president is not draining the swamp. The president is expanding the swamp. And by getting rid of Inspector Generals, and it's not simply Linick at State Department. 2 weeks ago, he got rid of a woman named, I believe it was Chris, from the, she was the Inspector General at the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. He previously had gotten rid of Steve Atkinson, who was the Inspector General of all of the intelligence agencies. And he's gotten rid of two others whose names I don't remember. So he's now gotten rid of 5 Inspector Generals. And what we know about the Inspector Generals is rather important. We know that the positions evolved after Watergate, during the 1970s, in reaction to Watergate. It was designed to have people who were really non-partisan. Not bipartisan, but nonpartisan. Not that anyone can be 100% objective, but for the most part, these people have been appointed. They have been supported by both Republicans and by Democrats. They are not, in the case of Linick, for instance, he's not a, quote, Obama appointee. Virtually all of these people have been have served, as I say, in a rather nonpartisan, objective fashion, and they are individuals who are there to make sure that the swamp does not expand. They are individuals there, in other words, to make sure that the people in these departments are doing what they are entrusted to do. And the word entrust comes, of course, is connected to the word trust, to give us confidence that monies are not being misspent, that there is not corruption. And I think that the Office of Inspector General, in that sense, has worked very, very well in all of these many different governmental departments. By firing Atkinson, by firing Chris, by firing Linick, what the president is doing is trying to eliminate, and is in fact eliminating, any kind of serious oversight of these different departments. He's putting people into positions, in other words, who are fully and completely supportive of him. I would think that any of us who want to see the elimination of corruption in Washington should be very, very concerned. And I think that there are two other things that I want to mention here. One specifically about this guy Linick. Linick is widely widely respected among both Democrats and Republicans, certainly throughout the entire State Department. He was investigating things. And we don't have the full story right now, so I don't want to say more than, I think I can legitimately say. But some of what he was investigating had to do with just misappropriation of funds by the Secretary of State, the use of government funds to protect the wife of the secretary, the use of government funds to pick up the secretary's dry cleaning and things like that. Minor stuff, and no one is going to take that very seriously. We don't have to worry very much about that. But there's another thing that the president is not saying. Yesterday, when the president was criticizing those who are criticizing him for removing Linick, he kind of made fun of the fact that some State Department official was forced to wash the dishes, I think, in Secretary Pompeo's kitchen. I don't know whether that's true or whether that's not, but what I do know is this, that beginning even during the transition period in 2016, going into 2017, and leading up to the inauguration of the president, Jared Kushner and other officials, that is to say, people who would be officials in the new administration, and that includes Michael Flynn, that includes the man who became the head of the National Security Council. These guys were angling with the Saudis and with the officials in the United Arab Emirates to provide $8 billion. We're not talking about washing dishes here. We're not talking about getting dry cleaning. $8 billion of nuclear technology to these countries. And normally, this kind of an appropriation, $8 billion, is going to be approved by the Congress and then approved, of course, and signed presumably by the president. But under certain emergency conditions, the president can bypass Congress. And that's what he chose to do here. So while many people on both the Republican and the Democratic side were furious in Congress that the president was sidestepping congressional authorization, the president did this. Now, why were the people in Congress so concerned about this? Number one, because it might give the Saudis the opportunity to develop nuclear weapons. In other words, to make the Middle East more unstable than it is right now. Secondly, because much of this followed the murder of Khashoggi, of Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered by the Saudi government. He was a Washington Post reporter murdered by the Soviet government in Turkey, in Ankara, Turkey, and the President Trump essentially just ignored the whole thing. He did not in any way condemn the Saudis for what they had done, and he did not in any way place real responsibility on the man, Mohammed bin Salman, who was, in the final analysis, responsible of that. And there's another reason why I think they were very, very upset in Congress, and that's that there's no congressional support on either the Democratic side or the Republican side for the war that the Saudis have been conducting in Yemen. So there are a whole bunch of different things which have led to real criticism of this $8 billion gift to the Saudi government. And when Linick, the Inspector General, began to look into that issue, it is at that point where Pompeo and where Trump said, we're going to fire him as a way of ending this investigation. And when Pompeo said, as he did this, within the past 2 or 3 days, that he did not know what the Inspector General was investigating, you can be sure that Pompeo, who graduated first in his class at West Point, you can be sure that Pompeo was not telling the truth. And by the same token, when the president said he knew nothing about Linick, you can be sure once again that he is not telling the truth. He rarely tells the truth, and he certainly did not say it in this instance. So when we talk about the Inspector General thing, I think we have to understand that there is much more going on than the president is going to reveal. And one final point I want to make. What you really have is not the firing of an Inspector General. You have a war against the institution of the Inspector General. And that's what dictators in places like North Korea and Hungary and Turkey, that's the kind of thing that they do. They don't want any oversight. They want no investigation of their own operations. It's a way of saying, I am the state. It's kind of Louis XIV idea. I am the state. And I think what we need in this country is a lot more oversight by watchdogs, a lot more oversight by inspector generals than anything we're going to get during the Trump administration.
Reading an article here online, Gary, from the Heritage Foundation about the heavy turnover in the Trump administration. I think this is a very telling statement. It says it was not surprising that John Bolton's departure had little impact on Trump's foreign policy. It was always Trump's policy. Do you see Donald Trump as a guy who goes through a lot of employees because he's got a vision and his staff who doesn't share it gets driven out of pushed out of the way? Is that what you see, Gary?
No, I don't see it that way at all. I don't think there is any vision whatsoever that the president has. If I asked you, or if I asked any listener who's tuned in right now to WLEA, what is Trump's foreign policy? You're not going to know the answer to that. You simply don't know the answer, and that is that there is no foreign policy. So, for instance, and I don't think that I'm exaggerating here. At one point, the president may say that we will support the Kurds. He does say that we will support the Kurds in Syria. And the very, very next week, he's saying that we are going to pull out of Syria, essentially, how shall I put it, kind of stabbing them in the back. He says that he's going to, support the United Nations. The next week, he's pulling out of the World Health Organization. We don't know where he is. He loves, he speaks fondly of the leader of China, and then he's criticizing 2 days later the leader of China. His foreign policy has been impulsive. His foreign policy, to the extent that it is a foreign policy, has been erratic. It's been very, very inconsistent. With all of the turnover, there have been 4 different people now who have served as chiefs of the National Security Council, with some very, very different ideas. For instance, General McMaster, when he was there, was highly supportive of our allies, of organizations like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and then Bolton, exactly the opposite, essentially undermining support for these things. Our so-called allies out there, I'm talking about the Canadians, the Germans, the French, the English, the Dutch, the Danes, the Norwegians, they don't know what we're doing. They don't know where we are. And because they don't know where we are, they are no longer able, they are no longer willing to trust the President of the United States and to trust the United States to defend their own interests. And consequently, I think we're in a situation where Trump has seriously weakened, very, very seriously weakened our standing abroad. We live in it. We may not want to believe this. We may not even want to, hope it exists. But we do live in an interdependent world. We live in a world where globalization has occurred. We can't go back to the 18th or the 19th century. And we're going to need to be cooperating with a whole bunch of other countries, and those other countries right now are much, much less likely to support us. And I want to say one last thing about this issue of international cooperation. President Trump announced as recently as yesterday that the United States may end entirely its support for the World Health Organization. He says this in the middle of an international pandemic, that we will end entirely our support for the World Health Organization. Well, when he said about a month ago or so, maybe 6 weeks ago, that we were going to reduce our funding to the WHO, the World Health Organization, it was one thing for him to argue that, they made some mistakes in the early part of the COVID-19 crisis, and therefore we can't trust them. But when we pull out, the Chinese said we Chinese are going to make up the monies. We are going to, in others, provide the monies, compensate the WHO for the monies that it's losing from the United States. So what's the real point of this? The point is that as the United States withdraws its support from many, many different kinds of organizations, including NATO, the Chinese are going to take advantage of that. The Chinese are going to step into the vacuum that President Trump is creating by withdrawing from, if you will, the rest of the world. This is not going to look good. This is not favorable for the rest of the 21st century. I think that we are in trouble, and it's not going to be so easy to dig ourselves out of the hole that we are, digging right now.
Going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a moment with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower.
Selecting a nursing home for a loved one isn't easy until you've discovered Hornell Gardens Nursing and Rehabilitation. Hornell Gardens delivers the highest level of care, compassion, and commitment with amenities and activities that will enrich body, mind, and spirit. It's a place that's close to home. Stop in for a tour of Hornell Gardens, located at 434 Monroe Avenue in Hornell, or to learn more, call 585-222-CARE or visit hurlbutcare.com.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn, who is getting warmer.
That's right, as will the rest of us, Brian. We've got some milder temperatures slowly working their way towards us, still dealing with this humongous storm system over southern Illinois this morning. It's producing cloudiness all the way from South Florida, up across the Carolinas, Pennsylvania, into central and western New York, into southern Ontario, and then back as far west as Nebraska. But there is high pressure headed our way. It's building across the northeast right now. It's cleared out the skies across New England and in the eastern part of our state. And eventually, it's going to clear our skies, and we're going to see better weather as the storm sinks down towards Atlanta. Today, we're on the boundary between the clouds to the west and the sun to the east. I think eventually we turn partly sunny. We're 65 to 70 this afternoon. The sun came up this morning at 5:44. It sets tonight at 8:30. We'll have clouds overnight, lows 40 to 45. We're going to turn partly to mostly sunny tomorrow. Nice day overall. Highs will be 65 to 70. Generally clear, cool tomorrow night, lows near 40. And a gem of a day coming up on Thursday. Thursday, bright sunshine, comfortable. Highs will be 70 to 75 Thursday afternoon, Brian.
Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower here on this Tuesday, May 19th. Gary, I'm looking at the This Day in History things. There's some interesting stuff here. Are you ready to move on to This Day in History?
Well, I wanted to say something about hydroxychloroquine, which the president has said he is taking for the past week. Maybe he is, but the president doesn't always tell us the truth, as I think we will understand by now. Do you believe he's taking that? Does anyone really believe that he's taking that? Would any serious doctor in the United States of America, knowing today what we know about hydroxychloroquine, that it is not effective against COVID-19, but it may, in fact, have side effects, including serious side effects in respect to cardio issues? I doubt it. I doubt it very much. But I'm otherwise happy to go to This Day in History. So tell me what happened on This Day in History.
In 1943, FDR and Winston Churchill plan D-Day for the first time. May 19, 1943, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt set a date for a cross-channel landing that would become D-Day. May 1st, 1944. They say the date was a little premature as bad weather was a factor. Just kind of curious, Dr. Ostrower, strategy question. Why were they thinking in terms of a year ahead? Why not sooner?
Well, they had really been thinking about it as early as 1942. And the reason they were thinking about it in 1942 is that the Soviet Union, which was bearing the brunt of the Nazi attack, when the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union on June 22nd of 1941, they did so with 3 million men. You know, the German army contained over 3 million, but 3.05 million to be exact. And it put a great deal of stress on the Soviets. The Soviets barely survived that first year. And then, of course, during Stalingrad, the Soviets lost another 1 million men, as did the Nazis, and that was beginning in September of 1942. So by 1942, the Soviets, that is to say Joseph Stalin, who was the Soviet leader, was pressuring Roosevelt and pressuring Winston Churchill to open up a second front in Europe to take the pressure off the Soviets, meaning that the Nazis would presumably have to move some of their troops to the Western Front. But we weren't prepared to do it, and we weren't prepared to do it it because we simply did not have the number of men and especially the number of ships that would be necessary, like landing craft, the so-called Higgins boats and so forth, that would ultimately ferry, literally over 1 million Allied troops into France in 1944. So the Soviets kept the pressure on. In 1943, much the same thing, and finally, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to the D-Day landing. But nevertheless, it still took a long time to build up, especially the equipment that was necessary for that kind of an amphibious landing. We had a landing in Anzio in Italy in 1944, and it didn't go so very, very well. And it kind of pointed up the degree to which you really have to be fully prepared if you're going to do this kind of an amphibious operation. And so it just took a long time until finally they were ready in June of 1944. You're right, Brian. Initially they were hoping to do it in May of 1944. Weather forced them to postpone it, and it almost forced them to postpone it yet again in June. Eisenhower made at that time, General Eisenhower, who was the head of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe, made a really rather risky decision to go ahead with this operation, and we all know today, of course, that it was brilliantly successful, in part because the Germans thought we were going to attack. When finally we would attack, they thought we would attack in a place called Calais, which is only 22 miles across the English Channel, and in fact we attacked in Normandy, which is much further away, around 100 miles from England, but where the Germans were not really expecting. In fact, when Hitler first heard about the Normandy invasion, he thought it was a diversion, and so he didn't move most of his army to Normandy, and that, of course, gave the Allies a real advantage in establishing a beachhead.
Dr. Ostrower, just kind of curious, in today's world, 2020, with phone tapping and everything else, you can email, sniffing and spying, and everything else that governments all over the world could do, could something like D-Day be pulled off in 2020, or maybe is that why they just stick to basically Air Force type wars these days?
Well, that's a good question. It was, no amphibious operation like this had ever been attempted before. Now, again, I mentioned Anzio, which wasn't so successful, but it was a much smaller operation. On the other hand, and this is not quite answering your question, after D-Day in 1945, the U.S. Launched operations, especially on some of the Pacific Islands, most importantly Iwo Jima, and then a few months later in Okinawa. At Okinawa, for instance, there were 1,200 ships, naval craft, that were involved in that operation. I mean, it's a huge invasion, and these things succeeded. Now, in 2020, would it be possible, given the surveillance operations and given the ability to break codes and whatnot that are a lot more sophisticated than they were way back during World War II? Brian, I don't know the answer to the question. I think it would be very difficult to pull it off.
We've been speaking with Dr. Gary Ostrower. As always, thanks for calling in, Gary.
Well, thank you for having me.